me a screw, feel my own adrenaline. Yeah, I do just what I do, and I hope you let me in, yeah.
Hello and welcome back, fellow anime lovers, to Cypherfics. I am delighted to have you join us once again in the world of fanfiction and fantasy. This is the second part of, What If Issei, Rias meet DanMachi. Special note, this fanfic is written and a masterpiece of Totallynotsnipez on fanfiction.net. Do check and support the author too. Now smash the like, share and subscribe button for more. Also press the bell icon so that you never miss such great parts. Thanks for the introduction. Now let's dive into the world. I was starting to think I may have underestimated the dungeon. Cutting down yet another goblin, I couldn't even waste time trying to retrieve its magic stone as another was on me in the next moment. It screeched as it tried to rip my throat out with its teeth. It had started relatively well, the goblins weren't exactly tricky, but since I had never fought monsters before, it was a good start. I had noticed the waves of goblins become more frequent, which I had assumed was because I traveled deeper into the floor. The situation had gotten slightly more serious when the groups of goblins got larger and didn't stop in quantity. Now, here I was, looking over the army of goblins screeching and trying to tear me apart. I believe that something may be wrong. SHT. I backed away from another goblin that dived at me with reckless abandon. Charging up yet another fireball, I shoot it into the crowd of goblins. The explosion of fire and the evisceration of a dozen goblins gave me time to run. Not for long though, as the place quickly filled back up with more goblins rushing at me. Running down the tunnel, I had to quickly take a left as goblins suddenly spilled from the other end. My magic reserves were low. I had done that little fireball trick 3 times already, with this being my 4th time. I had decided just a moment ago it was time for a tactical retreat. I really needed to look into a way of using some magic that didn't drain me instantly. Who knew magic that ran from your imagination would be so expensive? I ducked as a pair of claws tried to tear my throat out. Where the F had he come from? A goblin stepped out and I immediately bitch-slapped him away while I jumped past him. I didn't have time to finish him off, looking back at the army of goblins not far behind me. I was feeling oddly picked on right now. Was it about the 2 goblins in a barn joke I made? As I navigated through the first floor, trying to find any other adventurer who could tell me why the F I was suddenly being swarmed, I encountered a large spiraling staircase leading downwards, likely to the next floor. I was about to pass by it when I noticed several hordes of goblins spotting me from the opposite direction, charging towards me. Looking down at my torn, bloodied clothes from all the cuts I had gained, I clicked my tongue and sighed. As I ran down the stone steps, I hoped the chaos unfolding on the first floor wasn't happening on the second floor. Glancing upward, I saw the shadows of the goblins tumbling down the stone stairs in their frantic pursuit to attack me. Spotting the entrance to the second floor, I made my way through it and paused. Blood was everywhere and I saw bodies of adventurers scattered around, their bodies ruined beyond recognition. Though that wasn't why I had frozen, the tall grey bipedal humanoids covered in grey fur with a head resembling a wolf did. The muscled bodies of these creatures and the sharp teeth as they all huffed eerily similar to dogs made for quite the sight. Those claws appeared far sharper than the goblins had been. While I was confident I could handle a few of these creatures at the same time, there were still a few dozen who were currently ripping into the adventurers' prone bodies. Who was now beginning to turn their attention towards me. That alone wouldn't have deterred me if it wasn't for the distant screeches letting me know of the goblins' continued pursuit. I had considered myself decent at fighting, and my enhanced genes gave me a significant advantage. However, being swarmed didn't allow much room for strength to matter. My magic was a game changer and good at taking out hordes, if only it wasn't so goddamn mana intensive. I inspected the beings in front of me. So, these were kobolds, huh? They matched the description on the leaflet. They all turned to me and looked at each other, sniffing at me curiously. They had the same reaction as the goblins. We stood for a few seconds staring at each other as they looked unsure of what to do. The green light flashed in all their eyes and suddenly they all snarled before lunging at me. The closest got to me first and I swung my blade down at him only for claws to block it. I retreated it quickly and dodged its claw slash before decapitating it with a slightly clumsy swing of my blade. Another 2 kobolds came in and I quickly stabilized one through the eye while avoiding the attacks coming my way. I punched the other one with a quick jab and had to rip my sword out of the dead kobold's eye. The screeches of goblins got closer and as annoying as it was I needed to retreat again. Despite my confidence, I wasn't foolish. Whatever was happening in the dungeon was making the monsters appear in much higher numbers than they were meant to be. It just so happened I had picked a bad day to come to the dungeon. I ran back into the staircase and reluctantly ran down going to the 3rd level. I wasn't idle as the kobolds followed closely. I picked them off. I would let 1 or 2 get close to me before tossing it down the middle of the staircase, which descended so far that its end was beyond sight. By the time I reached the 3rd floor, I had killed almost all of the kobolds. That didn't help the fact the goblins' horde had been getting closer due to my attempts to thin the herd. I felt myself start to grow exhausted, despite my enhanced physique. This was starting to get ridiculous. However, I felt myself excited despite all of this. My drive to get stronger was simply growing. Maybe it was my devil side, but I couldn't wait to start gathering power. Are there any spell books like the one Belle got out there? Something to look into. I still felt that I had some demonic power left in the tank. I felt it regenerating at a slow rate. I abruptly stopped as I heard screeches coming from the 3rd floor entrance. Goblins started pouring out of the entrance a moment later and I took this time to ponder how the F I was going to get out of this situation. F it. Running away seemed only to escalate the situation. At least I could exploit the advantage on the stairs and simply push them off the stairs, sending them falling into wherever the bottom of the stairs led to. I let my demonic instinct burst free for once and let out a battle cry as I quite frankly lost my SHT. My anger made me let an uncharacteristic sneer appear on my face. I dove into the group of goblins. The goblins themselves took a step back and looked almost scared. I wasn't in the right mind to note this odd behavior, so I simply set on tearing them apart. I guess I was going to be late for dinner. I hope Hestia isn't too worried. Hestia. Hestia could be seen running towards the dungeon entrance in a panic. She had just heard the rumors of a dungeon flood happening within the first 3 floors of the dungeon and instantly remembered the plans Zeph had to start slow on the 1st floor. Zeph! She shouted desperately, zipping through the horde of adventurers standing around. No, 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 and no. She couldn't believe the bad timing. Standing on a crate she looked out over the sea of faces quickly, hoping to find that unique crimson hair in the crowd and make sure her Zephyrion wasn't hurt. The situation only got more desperate as every time Hestia spotted a man with anything closely resembling that unique crimson hair, it would be some injured adventurer that had BLD coating his hair. She couldn't help but curse fate for the first time in her life as she experienced a worry she had never felt before. She was a goddess who had never connected with any other being who couldn't handle themselves without needing her help, unlike Zephyrion, the first child to receive her blessing. It made him all the more special than he already was. This was Zeph's first adventure and it had been instantly interrupted in the eyes of Hestia. Sometimes life can be so unfair. Hestia thought. She shook her head and kept looking around. Some of the adventurers looked at her in pity, as if they understood who she was looking for was probably dead. This served to make her uncharacteristically scowl at them. She refused to believe her Zeph had died. After all, he had promised her he would take care of her and she wouldn't let him break that promise. Not after he had given her such hope and happiness. Zephyrion. I limped and flopped onto the ground behind the large stone that made for a good position to hide from the monsters still running around. I looked down at my body which was absolutely soaked with BLD. My head felt dizzy from all the BLD loss and I had tried patching up the bigger ones with pieces of my clothes to the best of my ability. I'm pretty sure I would be dead from BLD loss if I wasn't a devil. My devil genes seemed to make me more resilient to such things. All my demonic energy was spent, even the part of it I had regenerated was all used while fighting that death horde. I had committed a slaughter against the goblins and kobolds, my demonic instincts had made me use everything at my disposal. I had managed to significantly reduce their numbers, but in the end, I had still been forced to make a retreat. The number of them was simply too much for me to deal with right now. Luckily though, with the horde now much smaller, slipping away had been much more manageable. I tried to calm down my harsh breathing as I practically wheezed for oxygen, my lungs burning more than they ever had. I didn't even want to think about how I was going to leave the dungeon right now. I reluctantly inspected my sword, noticing the numerous chips on its surface. It became evident that this weapon wasn't intended for cutting down an army of goblins. Well, this wasn't ideal and certainly not how I expected my first dungeon run to go. I had expected to kill some monsters and be back for lunch with Hestia. This trip had simply meant to be a test of what I could do before I properly started exploring the dungeon, preferably with some better gear. I hadn't seen any other adventurer so far apart from the dead ones. Which is even more proof that something strange was happening. I'm assuming the dungeon was normally like what it had been when I first arrived, groups of goblins coming in waves, sometimes a larger group together. That had been manageable. What was not manageable was the big fuck-off army of screeching goblins coming at me like I had insulted them. Now here I was on the 3rd floor. I'm pretty sure I remember the way back up to the 2nd floor, but I was spent in terms of physical and mental energy. I closed my eyes and sat there regaining my breath. Screeches from passing goblins or the bestial growls of kobolds occasionally pierced the air as I could hear them run past where I was sitting. I didn't know how long I lay there, regaining my energy. A sniffing sound brought me out of my daze, as I sat contemplating my life decisions. Blinking in confusion, I looked up and was met with a kobold. Sniffing down at me in confusion. I stared blankly at it. It stared back at me. We stared before it started growling. I guess I would have to resort to my ultimate skill. Stop. I held my hand out. I was unsure if it understood, but its head titled in confusion. See, this is why no one likes you. I scolded it and somehow its wolf features managed to form a look of pure bafflement. I grabbed its hand and wrapped my arm around it. The boss isn't happy with your performance, young man. I poked it on the nose and chided it. I dragged its head down to eye level. It seemed to have regained its wits. The kobold growled and I slapped it. Oi, none of the backchat, young whippersnapper. Don't make me go get the belt. I growled and it looked unsure. I took this opportunity to spin it around and jumped on its back. Onwards and upwards. I screeched and slapped it on the back. You may be wondering what was happening. Was this some sort of hypnotic power? Perhaps a charming power forcing it to obey my commands? The answer was much more terrifying. The ultimate art of confusion. When in trouble, remove all logical thoughts and become a being of pure chaos. To be honest, I had no clue how this was working. I had noticed that the monsters in the dungeon seemed to hesitate for whatever reason. I had a suspicion that my demonic BLD was confusing the monsters. Thus I was able to get away with SHT like this. I doubt any adventurer would be able to speak without getting torn to shreds in my position. The kobold seemed confused. It didn't know whether to try to tear me to shreds or obey. I slapped its behind harder and growled into its ear. It suddenly started running. It stopped again and shook its head. Roaring in defiance, it suddenly came back to its senses and tried to shake me off. Alright, time for plan B. I focused my intent and my finger sparkled with a small flicker of fire. I slammed my finger on its backside and it howled in pain before taking off. Grabbing its ears, I used them as a steering wheel. Every time it slowed down I used my demonic energy which had recovered a tiny bit to make tiny sparks of flame. The sounds of whining and my manic laugh of triumph echoed through the hall. I'm a genius. Ace Wallenstein. Standing in the middle of a group of kobolds and goblins, a stunning platinum blonde-haired woman stood with an expression of apathy. Every time a monster came too close, her sword flickered up and cut through it effortlessly. This woman was known by the title of the Sword Princess. Ace Wallenstein, member of the Loki Familia and the best swordswoman in Orario. She had been sent to help clear the dungeon flood that had unexpectedly started a few hours ago. The rest of the Loki Familia had split up to cover more ground. Since this was a part of the upper floors, there was no need to stick together. 3 goblins disappeared as she flickered from her spot and effortlessly carved through the group of monsters. A few minutes later the entire group of monsters were dead. Ace shook her head as she stared at the group of dead adventurers. She took their adventurer identification there with a look of apathy. This scene wasn't too uncommon. The life of an adventurer wasn't as glamorous as people like to try to make it out. She went to continue looking for survivors and clearing the dungeon flood. Ace didn't expect to find anyone, maybe a few lucky ones, but most of the surviving adventurers were either higher leveled or had escaped in time. She paused as she heard a distant sound. Her face twitched cutely in confusion as she tried to strain her hearing. The sounds were getting closer. The first thing she heard was a monster, probably a kobold in her opinion, whimpering in pain. Then she heard it. A cackle of laughter. Around the corner came a kobold running with an expression of terror, and on the back of it sat a crimson-haired teenager cackling like a madman. Ace wiped her eyes and wondered if she hadn't gotten enough sleep. Never had she seen something so outrageous happen in the dungeon. A monster being rode upon. No chance. Monsters would do anything to kill an adventurer. It was part of why the job was so dangerous and needed to be approached with caution. The crimson-haired teen saw her and his eyes widened. As the kobold got closer to her she raised her sword and he quickly jumped off. The kobold regained its ferocious sneer and charged at her with reckless abandon, hoping to tear out her delicate-looking throat. Ace lazily swiped her sword and bisected the poor monster, making it disappear in a puff of black smoke and leaving a small broken crystal she didn't bother picking up. The crimson-haired teen got up and dusted himself off, and Ace's eyes widened as she saw the sheer amount of blood covering his torso. Cuts and scratches are barely patched up by ripped clothing. The teen grinned. "Nice weather we are having," he hummed. "Zephyrin." Staring at the gorgeous blonde, I grinned cheekily, as my eyes roamed her body. With a pair of golden eyes that stared at me with minor curiosity, her pouty lips were thinned in a neutral expression. Skin without blemishes and a curvaceous body. The woman was stunning. She wore a short skirt that made her amazing legs visible. Probably makes it easier to move around too. She held a saber in her left hand almost lazily. "What are you doing down here?" she asked in a deadpan monotone voice. "Well, see. I was just exploring the second floor when all of a sudden I was swarmed by an army of monsters. Don't suppose you could tell me what's going on? I'm new to this whole adventure gig," I explained with a lazy grin. She tilted her head. "You're a new adventurer?" she asked with confusion. "Yep, first time in the dungeon," I replied casually. "How are you alive?" she asked. "I guess as my teammate on Call of Duty would say, I'm built different," I replied teasingly. Technically I was built differently since I'm a devil, which saved my life for sure today. I thought I had been prepared and it had started well. I hadn't come here thinking I was going to beat the dungeon in a single day. Perhaps I should have made more preparations. She observed me silently before explaining. "A dungeon flood is currently in progress," she replied. I waited for her to explain only to stare flatly at her when she didn't continue. And a dungeon flood is? I questioned with a raised eyebrow. A dungeon flood is an odd phenomenon that occurs seemingly randomly. It makes the monsters spawn at a rapid rate and can cause groups of monsters to turn into miniature armies. This normally happens on the lower floors, which is extremely dangerous and can take days to clean up. This is the first time it's happened on the higher floors. She explained in the same monotone voice. I see, so that's why those groups I was easily handling suddenly became so large. I couldn't be blamed for a dungeon flood happening, could I? Here I was beating myself up, but it was an unnatural event. Though that begs the question, why did it happen now? Had I caused it? It had never happened before on the lower floors, and suddenly it did, when I showed up. The monsters act weirdly towards me and a dungeon flood happens. I guess I could think about it later, for now, I wanted to leave. Interesting, I don't suppose you could help me out of here? I wasn't exactly prepared to face multiple armies of monsters when I came down here. I asked while showing my chipped sword. She nodded and started walking away. I looked at her with an amused smile. So this was Ace Wallenstein, huh? Not exactly the social type. I followed after her as she cut down everything in her path. I observed her speed and had to admit she would destroy me in a fight. I couldn't even see her sword moving. I didn't know the power levels of this world, but in terms of my physical ability I was at the lower end of middle class. Probably due to the previous occupant of this body who hadn't trained at all past his magical training. Meaning my body was untrained, which made low middle class strength pretty good. Unfortunately, having a pure-blood devil bloodline mainly extended to my magic reserves and quality along with my clan trait, which was sealed. My magic reserves were still going through its rapid growth though. Even without any training or improvement from Hestia's blessing, which came in the form of the fauna, I should reach the lowest of high-class reserves when the rapid growth ends, and that's without any training. Which wasn't a small feat. The high-class level was officially the level of ascending past fodder. Many devils trained hundreds of years to reach that goal. As of now my reserves were around the higher end of the middle of the mid-class. Ace had been a blur and suddenly the kobolds were cut into pieces. I guess my devil physiology could only take me so far without any training. The adventurers in DanMachi seemed a lot stronger than I knew from my previous knowledge of the verse. I guess I couldn't expect everything to be the same. Still, considering she was a level 6 adventurer, it wasn't anything to fret over. I was mostly excited about the power I could receive from Hestia's blessing. We both spent some time walking through the dungeon as I watched Ace kill monsters. After a while of searching for other survivors in a somewhat awkward silence, she finally decided to take me out of the dungeon. I grinned as we finally made it to the dungeon entrance. Ace turned towards me. "You should get yourself healed," she stated while looking over my bloody form. I grinned. "Much obliged, my lady," I replied. She stared in confusion, as I walked off. Looking up at the dimming sky, I cursed. Hestia was going to be so mad. The entrance had adventurers lingering around with adventurers guarding the entrance. I saw some people stare at me with respect as I limped out. Suddenly a shout of "Zeph" came from beside me and a missile of silky black hair shot at me. I found myself glomped by a worried goddess. I groaned as I stumbled. Ouch. Despite the pain I felt, I wrapped my arms around the worried goddess. She squeezed me half to death before pulling back and taking in my current state. Wincing as I watched her expression go from relieved to confused and finally panicked. "Zeph! What happened?" she shouted in worry. I started only to be interrupted. "No. Never mind, you can tell me later, we need to get you healed," she commanded sternly and started dragging me. My eyes scanned through the crowd watching in amusement as I was dragged away. Until my eyes finally met with a pair of yellow-slitted eyes. Rose Fannet stared at me in shock. I flashed her a grin and a wink. Only to focus back on Hestia as he dragged me away. Finally, after 10 minutes of Hestia frantically dragging me, occasionally glancing back at me with panic. We arrived at our destination. A rundown pharmacy, with an old dirty window showcasing potions. The wooden building itself looked dirty and unkempt, an emblem of a healthy man. The door looked to be on its last legs when Hestia uncaring kicked it open. We were greeted by a startled woman at the counter. The inside of the pharmacy seemed to be in much better care than the outside. The woman had long brown hair, purple eyes and dog ears with a tail. She wore a skirt from which her tail sticks out from the back of and a shirt with asymmetric sleeves, with the left being short and the right being long enough to cover her entire arm. "Lady Hestia?" she asked startled, before her purple eyes flickered over to me and widened. "I need a healing powder," Hestia demanded. "Healing powder?" "Yes, Lady Hestia." She stammered, quickly bringing out a box. "How much?" Hestia questioned. 4,000 valley. She replied. Hestia winced and took out a pouch. She looked at the valley with depression before giving her the whole pouch. I felt bad. I'm guessing she had just used a massive chunk of her own money for me. The lady at the counter gave us the pouch containing the healing powder and Hestia didn't waste time again dragging me back with her. Luckily the pharmacy was close to the abandoned church and it didn't take much time until we were back. I was instantly forced to take off my shirt as soon as we entered. After a quick glance over me, Hestia started gently rubbing the golden powder over my wounds. "What is this stuff?" I questioned. "It's a weaker version of a healing potion. It will heal these wounds within a few hours. Just stay still," she said quietly, her eyes shimmering with wetness. Hestia looked to be finally letting her emotions out as she wiped at her eyes. Uncaring of my wounds, I brought her up into a hug. She froze as she ended up on my lap, before she returned the gesture, hugging me tightly. "I was so worried about you when I heard about the dungeon flood and didn't see you outside. I assumed the worst," she mumbled quietly with a sniffle. Hestia's arms tightening further. I winced at that. It had only been a little bit since we had met, but we had grown closer in that time. Hestia had been more than willing to become my closest confidant after so much loneliness down here in Orario. She was also incredibly easy to talk to and play around with. Nearly losing her first familia member so soon must have frightened her, especially after all the rejection she had faced. It must have taken its toll on her confidence, regardless of her being a goddess. "It's fine, you know I wouldn't let some stupid monsters eat me so quickly. I'm too delicious. If I'm going to be eaten it'll have to be by a higher floor boss and I won't be facing them for a long while," I replied comfortingly and she giggled. I lay myself down with Hestia on top of me and felt the exhaustion finally catch up. My adrenaline had worn off from fighting for my life all day. The extremely curvy goddess melting into my arms. Hestia didn't protest as we fell asleep. Staring down at the city of Orario, a appealing woman with long silver hair going down to her back sat sipping a glass of wine. Purple eyes looking down at specific locations with interest. She has skin as white as snow, with no imperfections, her full lips twisted into a flirtatious smile and an hourglass figure. Her clothes are in large part black and red, they expose most of her stomach and melons. She also wore 2 flower-like ornaments in her hair. She was currently watching over Orario looking for anyone or anything of interest. Some adventurers popped up who were slightly better than the rest, but mostly all had the same dull soul aura. This woman was none other than Freya. Goddess of the Freya familia, largely considered one of the most if not powerful familias in Orario. Freya was currently doing what she considered the most tedious part of her hobby. Scouting. Looking for someone new, an adventurer who was unique. Who had the capabilities to rise to the top and become an adventurer like no other. Unfortunately, this process normally took years to even find someone worthy of her attention. She looked boredly around until something appeared in Orario. Her eyes widened and the wine she had been leisurely drinking fell to the ground. Broken. She stood up and pressed her perfect face to the glass. Like a toddler looking at a zoo animal in fascination. A soul like no other appeared. She shook her head. Freya couldn't believe a being could possess such an aura. Normally a soul was blue, gray, black or golden in the case of heroic spirits. This soul, Freya's eyes twisted. A scary expression of obsessive curiosity shone in her eyes. A myriad of colors. A dark crimson storm surrounding a swirling rainbow. She had never seen anything like it. Instantly her eyes snapped to the owner of such a soul. A crimson-haired teen covered in blood being dragged by Hestia. Freya licked her lips in anticipation. A face that would make any sane person run away in fright appeared. What a fascinating soul. Freya thought in an almost intoxicated manner. She instantly called for her familia members. She needed to know who this boy was. Whoever he was, she would have him, and his potential would be brought to reality. Stop moving. Hestia chided lightly as she sat on my back. Hestia was currently straddling my back to check over my fauna. 10 minutes had passed since we woke up, entangled in each other's embrace. As I shifted, I couldn't help but feel the lingering sensation of pain from the cuts that had only recently been healed from the healing powder. While the healing powder was much slower acting than a healing potion which essentially healed all wounds and diseases instantly, the healing powder had made sure no scars had formed. A light gasp caught my attention. I felt Hestia's delicate fingers trace over my back. I'm guessing that's good news? I asked. Fighting and living through an army of monsters has to count for something, right? I swear, I would find a way up into Tenkai and behead all those gods if they weren't impressed by this. That would be putting it lightly, Hestia softly said with excitement evident in her voice. Your stats have taken a huge boost. Hestia replied with a hint of admiration in her voice. I suppose the gods shall get to keep their heads for now. I knew my first child would be impressive. She squealed and pulled me into a tight hug. After a tight hug that tested the limits of my ability to hold back my slumbering dragon from awakening, Hestia updated my fauna and I felt a massive surge of power. My body was filled with energy as a golden glow pulsed out and I clenched my fist. I felt energized. My demonic energy also expanded noticeably. My demonic reserves become larger and deeper. My perception became a tiny bit sharper and I felt amazing. I checked my stats with a grin. I see. So that's how it works. For a brief explanation. In the DanMachi stat system, values range from 0 to 999, with the rate of stat gain slowing as adventurers approach higher stats. Each set of 100 stats corresponded to a rank, starting from I ascending all the way up to S. You had to defeat monsters or perform feats that would impress the gods, to collect excelia, which the fauna stored to enhance your attributes. Your stats could be further boosted by doing actions related to them. For example, performing physical activities should increase your strength stat, with the speed of growth depending on the excelia you earned. An adventurer who used a sword and relied on speed would have much higher stats in both strength and dexterity. They would still get some extra boost in the other attributes, but since they focused on performing acts with those two stats, the gains would be much weaker. High-quality excelia meanwhile required an adventurer to perform a feat worthy of impressing the gods, which further allowed an adventurer to level up. I was still level 1. I wanted to go back into the dungeon at some point because I felt like I had held myself back with my caution. I felt like I was far stronger than I was consciously allowing myself to be. I also took some time to reflect on what had happened. Turns out my suspicions had been correct. The massive increase in monsters hadn't just been a part of the norm within the dungeon. According to Issei, an event called a dungeon flood had coincidentally taken place during my first time dungeon diving. A strange phenomenon that caused the dungeon monsters on certain floors to suddenly increase 20-fold in number. Hestia had filled me in when I had asked her about it. After all, if that had been the dungeon's norm I would have had to hold off on dungeon diving for a while and train instead. Perhaps even staying on the first floor and training myself up until I couldn't handle it. Thankfully, that wasn't the case. However, I would be more cautious moving forward. While dungeon floods were apparently rare, I didn't want to think about the thought of being trapped on a lower floor during one. Now I understand that if a dungeon flood occurs, my best chance of survival is to head either higher or lower, depending on the location of the dungeon flood. Even if I have to descend to a lower level, facing two stronger monsters is preferable to battling an unending horde of weaker ones. Unless I have some powerful AoE spells, I could do just that. Unfortunately, my magic cost me a lot at the moment even though I had been able to shoot quite a few large fireballs. I should probably get to work on controlling my demonic power so I could use it more. I would also be on the lookout for any other magic that had less of a cost. Perhaps look for one of those grimoires. Since my magical training had been rudely interrupted by my accidental arrival into another world. I would have been trained earlier if it wasn't for my demonic power being weird and having two overprotective sisters. Anyways, that knowledge on escaping a dungeon flood in progress would have been a good piece of information that they should add to their little flyer next time. I smirked as I remembered the face of Rose. The pure look of confusion on seeing me alive had been funny. Compared to her normally cold and frigid mask, it was pretty cute. Now, if only my body would stop experiencing phantom pains from all the damage I had received. My wounds were healed but the pain persisted. At least it wasn't for nothing, I thought as I looked towards the small pile of small purple stones. I hadn't been able to get a lot of them since I was busy fighting for my life, but the time building up to that had been profitable. I would need to visit the guild and see how much I could get for monster crystals. Hestia had used up all the Valis buying the healing powder to ensure I was healed. I smiled as I watched her concentrate intently, checking my naked torso for any visible scarring. I also had time to think about my experience in the dungeon. Ignoring the dungeon flood, there was the fact the monsters had acted strangely around me. I had confirmed with Hestia that if any normal adventurer had tried the stunt I had pulled with the kobold, they would be found half-eaten and all dead. A normal person would have been thrown off instantly, despite the pain the kobold felt, and would have had their throats torn out. Despite some of my actions, I wasn't a dumbass who was going to ignore the fact it could be because of my devil BLD. That did leave a far more serious question. Did I start the dungeon flood? This had been the first one ever to happen on the starter floors. Then here I come in, the monsters act strange and even sometimes downright peaceful. If I did somehow cause the dungeon flood, then that would mean I was capable of causing a lot of deaths. This also begged the question, would a dungeon flood happen every time I entered the dungeon? I wasn't sure how to feel about that. If it turned out to be true, I might get many adventurers killed. While I wouldn't feel much guilt from it, I would still prefer they live. Was it because I was a devil? I did know that they were different in the way they perceived things from the memories. My musings were cut off by the gentle voice of Hestia. Okay, it seems like all your wounds have healed up, Hestia said, her voice laced with soft concern. But do you still feel any pain? I briefly considered whether to tell her the truth. Telling her I'm in pain will make going out harder. Not to say that she could stop me, but the attempts and pouts I would receive would definitely demotivate me. A look into her sapphire blue eyes filled with concern made me pause. The fact that she could detect lies as a goddess definitely extinguished my longing to lie. For the sake of my self-image, I'll focus on the former thought and make it the reason. It still hurts a bit, but I should be able to move around, I replied with a smile. Hestia frowned. You need to rest and heal back up to 100%. I'll go see if I can take a loan for some anti-pain medicine. Sta. I effortlessly scooped her up in my arms from her place straddling my chest, her curvaceous frame molding snugly against me. I hugged her gently like a teddy bear, nearly slipping as one of my hands accidentally sunk into the expansive flesh of her divine butt from my attempts to keep her propped up with one hand. Seriously, I wasn't a virgin, but that couldn't be natural. That was but worth worshipping if I had anything to say about it. I quickly stopped myself from marveling at the sensation and forced Zephyraion Jr. back to sleep. I then proceeded to lay her down on the bed with a gentle complimentary pat on her head. Turning around, she looked a bit dazed and a small blush could barely be seen on her pale cheeks at the sudden turn of events. I hurriedly scooped the monster crystals into a pouch and made my way towards the exit of the abandoned church. "Hey!" Hestia stuttered. Regaining her bearings and hopping up, sliding in between me and the exit. I raised an eyebrow as she held her arms in front of her. I didn't stop my walk as she skidded back in her attempts, while I watched in slight amusement. "Hestia, you do realize I need to go sell these crystals?" I asked her. Raising the pouch full of monster crystals and shaking it in an almost exasperated manner. "You need to rest and heal. Let me take care of you, Zeph. It's the least I can do." Hestia replied sternly. Which was kind of cute. "I've already healed, thanks to the healing powder. It's just some residual stinging, nothing serious. We need money and I refuse to let you degrade yourself by working at some food stall," I replied, with a flat tone. Hestia's stubborn expression remained unchanged, but I couldn't bring myself to feel irritated by the fact that my goddess was so determined to take care of me. In fact, being treated with such care and concern was something that had never really happened, not including my life as Zephyraion. It felt surprisingly nice. While I may like it, it just wasn't very productive. I let out a sigh. This was going to take a while. Scene break. After almost 10 minutes of consolation and promises, I was able to go out. I strolled into the Adventurers Guild building, the pouch of monster crystals held firmly in my hand. Making my way to the counter, I greeted the receptionist with a nod, receiving a bored-rehearsed greeting in return. I emptied the contents of the pouch onto the tray he provided. 33 monster crystals in total. Most of them were the small dark monster crystals that belonged to goblins. A few of them were a bit bigger and clearer, these belonged to kobolds. The majority of the monster crystals I had been able to take out of the dungeon with me were from goblins, since I had been actively picking them before the whole dungeon flood event. Only a few belonged to kobolds. From what I was able to deduce about the currency of Orario, $2 were worth 100 valis. Meaning every 1,000 valis was worth $20. 33 monster crystals, I stated, sliding them across the counter. The receptionist quickly examined the crystals before consulting a chart behind the counter. After a moment, she looked back at me and replied. With a total of 26 goblin crystals and 6 kobolds crystals coming to 33 monster crystals. 1,200 valis per goblin crystal and 2,500 per kobold crystal. That would be 46,200 valis in total, the receptionist muttered boredly. I grinned. With the customary 3% guild tax from your earnings, the receptionist's monotone voice continued. I frowned. The F are they taxing me for? The receptionist opened a counter lazily and slowly, without a care in the world, counting the valley and putting it on the counter. You end up with 44,814 valid total. Here you go. $896.28 counting the conversion rate. Not bad. Still. May I ask why I'm being taxed? I questioned as politely as I could muster. The receptionist didn't look surprised, if only mildly annoyed. Maintaining his professional demeanor, he explained. The taxes are for the services provided by the guild, including management and administrative costs. I nodded in response, and he looked slightly shocked that I didn't make a big fuss about it. How could I? My old government used to take way more for doing a whole lot of nothing. Tucking the pouch away, I made to leave, only to come face to face with a pair of slitted yellow eyes. I would never admit that I jumped a little bit. There stood the cold beauty that was Rose Fannet. Yo! Rose took my hand in a firm grip and led me to the familiar small guild advisor room. I simply followed along, slightly curious. I glanced down at her hand pulling mine. Oh, my. Such a lewd act of affection. Mother always told me handholding was meant for after marriage. Explain, Rose demanded. I'm not the father, I replied instantly, doing what anyone should do when they are faced with a vague question. Rose looked baffled at my supreme art of mental warfare, but she recovered quickly, sending a very cute glare my way. What are you talking about, Mr. Gremory? She asked, her tone cold. Nothing important. What did you want to ask? I replied casually. Rose appeared ready to reply but suddenly fell silent. You were right in the middle of a dungeon flood as a complete novice adventurer. It was your first time dungeon diving. How did you manage to survive? I was sure you were dead. Rose questioned me. I gave her a lopsided grin, only feeling a bit of satisfaction at her confusion. She had been so quick to write me off as another dead adventurer in the making. What a cold woman. I guess I just have a knack for surviving, I replied nonchalantly, my grin widening. And hey, you shouldn't underestimate a level 1 adventurer. We may not look like much, but we're full of surprises. Rose narrowed her eyes at me, clearly skeptical. Surviving a dungeon flood as a level 1 adventurer dive? I've been here a long time, and I've seen many adventures that thought themselves special. Some even were special. What many people don't know is that the dungeon is alive. It watches, it waits, and it'll wear you down. Rose said harshly, looking the most emotional I had seen her. A change from her normally apathetic mask. My expression hardened as I kept silent, listening intently. The dungeon was alive. Was she being dramatic, or was that the strange force making the monsters turn hostile? I don't insult or try to push you away from the horrid path of an adventure due to some sort of jealousy. I do it because I've seen hundreds of you go in and only a few dozen still remain. That's not even including dungeon floods. Which is why it leads me to believe that maybe you're lying about being a level 1 adventurer. Rose said analytically. Yeah, that's pretty much what I gathered from the brief moment I saw her expression shift to sadness. She's not a bad person, she just has her own idea of what she thinks is the right choice. You want the truth? I questioned with an easygoing grin. Rose nodded her head seriously. Well, the truth is I'm a devil prince from another world. I had accidentally triggered something that has forced me into this world. I clicked my tongue with a Watkinudo shrug. Rose sighed. I see you aren't willing to be serious, Rose said, her tone thinly laced with disappointment. I shrugged once more. I feel the need to inform you that falsely identifying your level regardless of whether it's higher or lower is illegal, Rose commented. I have nothing to worry about then, I responded easily. The cold yellow-slitted eyes of Rose bore into me before she nodded. Even if I can admit you're not like any ordinary rookie adventurer, you should still be cautious. There are plenty of other professions besides adventuring, such as being a shop owner, guild employee, blacksmith. Rose advised. I rolled my eyes. Yeah, I think I'll stick with being an adventurer, I replied simply. Then let me caution you, don't get too cocky about this victory. Whether it was luck or skill, you've barely scratched the surface of what the dungeon holds, Rose warned. I waved her concerns off. Anyway, I wouldn't want to take up more of your valuable time. I'm sure with your beauty and responsibilities you have plenty of things to attend to. Until next time then, I cheekily replied. Rose didn't look amused by my jab at her beauty. Scene break. I thanked the man at the food stall as I began making my way back to the abandoned church. I had just brought a bunch of food to celebrate. Celebrate what? I don't know, but I felt oddly jovial as I walked down the bustling streets full of people. My body stiffened as I subtly glanced to an alleyway, 2 cloaked figures watching me intently. I frowned, I don't know how, but I had somehow felt their gaze on my back for a single moment. They seemed to notice my odd behavior as I had slowed down, my shoulders tensed. A second later the 2 cloaked figures backed away into the darkness of the small alleyway. I didn't bother chasing them. They were quick and probably knew their way around Ororio much better than me. Chasing them would also alert them to the fact I saw them. They were suspicious of my sudden change in demeanor, but that could be written off. I scowled. Why was I being watched? I had only been here for a few days. I sighed in annoyance. This was only more reason to become stronger. While the blessing of the Falna was good, it was only an enhancement. I wanted to begin physical training to increase the gains from it. I doubted Hestia would let me into the dungeon for a day or two due to the dungeon flood incident anyway, so it's something I can focus on until I can go dungeon diving again. After that, I'll have to make a schedule for it. I caught sight of the abandoned church, glancing around to see if anyone was still watching. I made my way inside once I confirmed it was clear. Best to be extra cautious going out from now on. Hestia, I'm back, I called out. After I got no response in return, I began looking around in confusion. A quick search around showed she was gone. She must have gone out. I guess I'll wait for her to come back before eating. I flopped down onto the couch, drumming my fingers. What to do in the meantime? Hestia. Hestia sighed in relief as she sank into the hot water of the temple bath. She hadn't visited in a while, as gods were naturally clean and didn't produce body fluids, but lately, she felt the need to indulge. The baths always made Hestia's skin shine more, and she knew Zephyrion was busy exchanging the monster crystals. So, she had decided this was the perfect time to sneak out and freshen herself up, wanting to look her best for him. She raised a finger to her cheek as the goddess of the hearth thought about her special and only child, a small blush tinting her cheeks. A small giggle left her lips at his antics. Zephyrion was a very chaotic person after all. Oh my, Hestia. I haven't seen you in here for a long time, what's the special occasion? A melodious voice teased. Hestia's appealing smile dimmed as she gazed over to the form of Freya. Humph, it just so happens I do, Hestia replied, earning an amused eyebrow raise from Freya. Freya smiled politely. Oh my, do tell, Freya replied teasingly. Hestia crossed her arms under her substantial bust and smiled proudly. It just so happens I have a new familiar member, Hestia responded. Freya came to sit beside her. Congratulations. He must be quite the special person to inspire such a reaction from you. Freya replied smoothly, her purplish eyes observing Hestia. Hestia beamed and went to speak before pausing. How did she know Zephyrion was a he? Hestia thought, starting to feel the familiar obsessiveness she had started feeling about Zephyrion. How did you know my new familiar member was a he? Hestia responded, trying to sound casual and hide the growing agitation in her stomach. Freya paused, her lips thinning before she covered it up easily enough. Lucky guess, you've got me intrigued now, why don't you tell me a bit more about the man that's got you so worked up? Freya smiled invitingly. Hestia's eyes squinted, the feeling of dread growing stronger at the vague reply and attempt at fishing for information. Why does she seem interested in Zeph? Also, how does she know of him? Hestia wondered suspiciously. Freya and Hestia stared each other down. Did I hear that correctly, Hestia's trying to look good for a man? A voice came from beside them as another goddess with appealing orange hair spoke with a teasing tone. If even the version goddess is dressing to impress, I might have to meet this lucky man, another voice giggled. The gossip started among the goddesses, causing Hestia to bury her face in her arms to hide her blush. A shadow loomed over, revealing the form of a fat goddess. A man, you say? Better watch out, ladies, or I might snag him for myself. The Titan jumped into the pool a moment later, creating a devastating tsunami that enveloped everyone. Amidst the chaos, Freya slipped away unnoticed. I inhaled deeply and exhaled as I found myself sitting in a lotus position. Since Hestia had decided to leave and go off on her own somewhere, I had decided it was about time I started working on my demonic energy control. It had taken some usage to get used to doing it physically instead of going off my secondary memories that showed me how it was done through magical tutoring. Copying it from memory just wasn't the same as actually trying it out. I should be able to be more adventurous with it. I focused inside myself where I felt that raging ball of chaotic energy every time I used demonic energy. The red ball of chaotic swirling energy inside me became clear to me as I delved deeper into a weird trance. The problem I was having with my spells was the demonic energy was wildly trying to escape along with the spell. This led to wasted demonic energy residue that flaked off uselessly. Luckily I had memories guiding me. Sending a probe of intent at the orb, it immediately responded and pushed back against it. My intent had been to make it move, but the demonic energy rebelled like its creator. Wait, did Lucifer even create demonic energy? Food for thought. The brief lapse in concentration caused the demonic energy to snap back into its chaotic swirling state. With an aggravated sigh, I focused again. I kept prodding the ball of demonic energy with intent before using my will to command a small sliver of it to run through my body. It was a slow process and I was fought by the demonic energy every step of the way. No wonder we use magic circles. Seriously, what the F is up with this energy? Even the little help they do with control should be appreciated. The fact it also kept amplifying my emotions made it strong to concentrate. The unexplained hatred along with many other suppressed emotions suddenly getting out of control, forced me to take practiced deep breaths. Zeph. Hestia suddenly appeared. Ah! I cried out in surprise as I pathetically fell off the couch. I had been so focused on trying to gradually increase its speed that I hadn't noticed Hestia enter the room. She giggled and I sent her a look of irritation. Sorry, you just looked so focused. She giggled out and I rolled my eyes. Hopping back up easily, I dusted myself. So where did you go? I questioned idly as I flopped back down onto the couch lazily and she blushed lightly. Just out, Hestia replied lamely. I sent her a flat look before shrugging. If she didn't want to share I wouldn't pry. She plopped herself right next to me. Did the transfer at the guild go okay? She asked after a moment. I responded by taking out a pouch filled up with Valley. Giving it a tantalizing shake and lightly handing it to her. Yup, 44,814 Valley in total, I responded cheerfully. Hestia hummed happily. What were you doing? You looked like you were focusing on something. Are you okay? Hestia asked. I was trying to improve my control over my demonic power, I replied, laying my head down. That chaotic energy I can feel within you. Hestia affirmed. I nodded lightly. Yeah, turns out there's a reason demonic circles were created to help with control. It's pretty strong. I replied with a TSK of faux annoyance. We sat there and chatted about nothing special in particular. Hestia made for good company when she wasn't being a missile of energy. I noticed she seemed to be looking extra clean today, her silky hair having a healthy shine to it. Her skin also looked extra smooth and shiny. I secretly checked her out and was satisfied with my observations. Wait, had she gone to the bathhouse all the gods go to? That would make sense. Why did she try to keep it a secret though? Zeph? Hestia questioned and I was brought back to reality. My eyes briefly glanced down to her soft lips as she had her head on my shoulder, extremely close to my face. Want to go grab some lunch? I asked out of the blue after we stared at each other for a while. She nodded with a small blush. I grinned in response. Scene break. I wiped my forehead as I just finished the basic workout routine I had developed. My thoughts were along the lines of, if the fauna boosted what was already there, why not add to that? I had just completed my 2000th press-up. Turns out that having an insane physique meant working out required a lot more to tire me out. It had been a week since the dungeon incident, and Hestia had been quite firm on not letting me dungeon dive after that. She had been acting like a warden, following me wherever I went. Not that I minded, her company was always welcome. I could have gone within the dungeon if I wanted to, but I genuinely didn't want to worry her. The short-busted goddess had also been acting like my own personal cheerleader since I had come here, supporting me more than anyone had before at anything I tried. That thought brought an image of Hestia wearing a cheerleading outfit to the front of my mind. Naturally, Zephyrion Jr. arose like a trained soldier standing at attention in front of his general, ready to go to war. I pushed those thoughts down and started the last part of my daily routine. Touching up on my martial arts training, I wouldn't claim to be a MSTR or anything, but I had been forced to learn martial arts in my old life since the place I had lived in wasn't exactly friendly. It was useful for conserving stamina with breathing. It wasn't anything like total concentration breathing from Demon Slayer, but it was useful. My fists struck out multitudes faster than my previous life. I went through 3 jabs and a hook in a flash of movement. Keeping my footwork light and malleable. Ready to move around at a moment's notice, I sent another jab as I imagined an opponent. Ducking to the side and narrowly avoiding a punch from the imaginary figure, I sent a jab and kick, forcing it to stumble back. I took advantage of its lowered guard and sent a nasty hook. Rattling my imaginary opponent's head and forcing it into a daze, I followed up with a nasty combo of rapid jabs and a spin kick. My concentration was lost as I heard a cheer. "Ho go Zeph!" Hestia cheered from her place on the couch. I merely shook my head in amusement at my cheerful goddess. I really should look into that cheerleader outfit. I let out a breath, slowing the hyperfocus I had been in and adrenaline. I performed a few stretches to relax my muscles. "Alright, I'm heading out," I announced, and Hestia pouted. "Zeph, stay with me," Hestia asked, opening her arms invitingly. I paused as the tantalizing view of my appealing goddess was taken into serious consideration. "I'll be back later," I responded a moment later, and the adorable pout magnified. I rolled my eyes, tossing her the money pouch with a sly wink as I left. I was now deemed safe by the almighty authority that was Hestia, Aurena's who. So I wasn't under constant surveillance. This meant I could finally dungeon dive once again. Hopefully without the whole army of monster things. I didn't feel like spamming fireballs again. Despite Hestia's casual attitude, I could tell she was worried. The slight tremble and biting of her perfect nails made it easy to see. Acting confident should put her mind slightly more at ease for now, though I think it'll take a few runs of nothing happening to calm her down. I practically skipped my way down to the dungeon. I hadn't been able to test my magic out other than slowly getting a better grasp on manipulating demonic energy. Other than spamming massive ball of fire, I wanted to experiment more. Perhaps even incorporate it into my martial arts. It takes a while to build up, but I'm sure with my improvement in control it will become easier as I progress. I made my way towards the large dungeon entrance, the foreboding aura of it and the eerie way all noise seemed to die when entering. A grim silence of determination taking precedence among the adventurers. Not including me. I hummed a song from my old world, feeling particularly upbeat. Perhaps it's because I was a devil that the strange aura didn't seem to bother me as much. Some adventurers looked at me like I was already dead meat. Probably due to my lack of armor. Unfortunately, the original sword I had gained from the guild was lost, but with 5,000 Valley I had bought a new if not a slightly worse replacement. It was of no worry though, I was here to grind. I needed to start making more Valley for Hestia and me. She was still trying to convince me to allow her to work, and that was an insult to my ability to provide. A feral grin appeared on my face for a moment before I reined it back. It seemed like my devil instincts were playing up again. I remember what had happened last time when I had given in to them and ended up slaughtering everything during the flood. I'm pretty sure my sin was either pride or wrath, but I wasn't too sure on which. I steadily broke away from the main stream of fellow adventurers entering the dreary-looking dungeon. Down the large spiraling staircase. The haunting silence I had been subjected to last time returned. To be honest, I felt more nervous than I acted. The brief thought that another dungeon flood could occur due to my presence wasn't exactly comforting. If I even saw a hint of it starting, I was bailing and reconsidering my stance on dungeon diving. A screech alerted me to the small green humanoid figure of a goblin making its presence known. Pausing and doing the usual routine of being confused before screeching and rushing me, its sharp claws come for me. I sidestepped, kicking its leg, which caused it to stumble, and I sliced its head off. Experience dealing with these clumsy little F-airs had made it even more effortless to kill them. I dug out its little crystal and watched its body dissolve into black smoke. Yeah, not strong when I wasn't surrounded by hundreds of these F-airs. I put the monster crystal into a pouch I had bought especially to store them in. I swirled the blade a bit novishly. Perhaps I should look into learning how to wield a sword properly. 2 more goblins rounded the corner and charged me with reckless abandon. Gaining an idea, I focused my intent. Imagine, supply and will. A clear image of what I wanted appeared, and I grinned, and the sword suddenly lit up with flame. Raising the blade, I imagined what I wanted to happen and sliced it down. I used a big amount of my energy and proceeded to gawk as a massive crescent slash exploded out, consuming everything in front of me in a wave of fire and dissecting the 2 poor goblins. Then, after instantly burning up their corpses into ashes, only their monster crystals remained on the floor. The crescent slash of fire traveled all the way down the cave-like hallway and exploded when it impacted the end wall, which made the dungeon tremble slightly. No wonder it took a massive amount of demonic energy. Holy F. My face stretched into a massive grin. I glanced down at my sword only to abruptly frown. The once straight blade was steadily starting to glow red and warp. SHT. I dispelled the fire immediately and summoned a small amount of ice to coat the blade from my imagination magic. By the time the blade cooled down, it was slightly wonky and bent out of place. Oh dear. I probably should have foreseen this. At least it was still usable. Screeching announced the fact I had drawn quite a bit of attention. A group of 4 goblins started charging at me from behind. Shrugging, I got into a solid stance. Shooting off, I carved through the group of goblins with a wild grin. Scene break. I made my way down to the 3rd floor, somewhat carefully. I was still weary of a dungeon flood. There had been no signs so far, but I kept the usage of magic non-existent after my first test to save on energy. Just in case. Entering the 3rd floor, as I entered the archway leading into a new set of hallways. The wolf heads of the kobolds snarled after doing the basic confused action. I dodged a claw swipe and effortlessly cut the first kobold's arm off, elbowing the second in the throat, forcing it back as it stuttered to regain breath. I swung and decapitated the first, and pierced the second through the heart. Ducking the third's dive, I slashed it through the head at an odd angle. I winced. That didn't look right. I proceeded to loot their corpses for their monster crystals. I spent the next hour or so just hunting down the small groups of kobolds, taking a few breaks in between, which wasn't easy since the monsters came in constant waves. I could see how normal adventurers got tired and ultimately ended up dying. I found that not being constantly F'd by an army of endless monsters on the 3rd floor was actually pretty manageable. My devil genes were definitely showing their benefit. I had seen some first-level adventures struggling against monsters on the 1st floor, and it had given me a view of how overpowered my existence was. I still had no idea what my current strength was at, since I hadn't exactly been going around picking fights with any level 2 adventurers. My eyes traveled over to the archway leading to the stairway that would lead me down to the 4th floor. I didn't want to be an idiot like Rose had suggested and rush in recklessly. Yet, I was cleaning through these kobolds with relative ease. Plus, according to the leaflet, the only difference was it spawned both goblins and kobolds with a higher spawn rate. Might as well. It would be good to find where my limit was anyway. Scene break. I think I may have gone a bit overboard. What had initially meant to be a trip down to the 4th, maybe even the 5th floor to test how strong I was had ended up going much further than intended. I jumped away as a massive torrent of flames tore through my previous position. The dense mist was not making it easy to keep a track of the small wannabe dragon. A thunderous roar of bestial rage rang out a moment later. 2 red glowing eyes were the only thing keeping its entire body in view as I jumped away easily. The dungeon space had become much larger the further I went down. I had found myself descending without much challenge. The killer ants had only been mildly inconvenient with sheer numbers, they all kept letting out weird screams that kept attracting more of them. My pouch had long since been overflowing with monster crystals by this point. Turns out I had been being too careful, stupid Rose had made me all cautious and the dungeon flood hadn't helped that belief. Now, here I was fighting what I believe is an infant dragon. On the 11th floor. Yup, I had gone all the way down to the 11th floor. It turns out I had been massively underestimating my devil physique. Which in turn had made me subconsciously hold back. I don't really know how that worked, but I had come to find that I was a lot stronger than I initially thought. I jumped away from another blast and launched myself closer to the infant dragon. The infant dragon stood at a height of around 150 centimeters and was 4 meters long. Its scaled tail whipped out and tried to hit me. I slid under it and landed a solid punch to his cheek. Unfortunately, my cheap sword had long since stopped working at this point, so I was forced to rely on my fists and magic. The infant dragon's scaled head snapped back as its entire body was sent rolling back. A few scales fell off as a large amount of monster blood spurted out. It roared in pain and sent a massive wave of flame at me. Jumping, I sent a beam of frost at its body, the ice immediately freezing its body to the ground. Fire spewed erratically out of its mouth, soon melting the ice away and getting up to face me. I simply grinned at its determination. I've discovered that I was a bit of a battle maniac. I couldn't help it, I just felt so alive. I jumped back on a tree and watched as it charged me. A fireball shot at me and I jumped, allowing the tree to explode in flames. I smashed down on top of it, sending more scales dislodging from its draconic face. Honestly, I was pretty lucky to stumble upon the infant dragon. I had found it chewing on a corpse, so I'm guessing an overly ambitious adventurer had tried to slay it. Probably risked it due to the fact infant dragons were meant to be rare, I think. There were a lot of new monsters on the floors above floor 10, I had run into a few orcs which were large creatures with pig heads that held a huge amount of strength. I had also encountered imps. Tricky little F-airs that were basically smarter goblins that grouped up, attacking in massive forces. I think there were some more creatures on this floor, but I hadn't run into them yet. I performed a spin kick to the dazed infant dragon and a series of powerful punches that repeatedly knocked scales off its body. I let out a breath after my onslaught, the infant dragon barely standing. "How's that for power, you small wingless wannabe dragon?" I taunted with a grin. Crazily enough, the wingless infant dragon looked like it understood. It unleashed one final torrent of flames from its gaping maw before I delivered the decisive blow. With a powerful strike, I brought it crashing down, the infant dragon's head collapsing moments later. My arm glimmered with a faint red aura. Throughout the battle, I had been channeling the limited amount of demonic energy I possessed into my arm, bolstering its strength. While it required deliberate focus and wouldn't be practical in a life-or-death situation, I was steadily improving my control over it. I let out a tired sigh, sweat glistening on my skin after all the exercise I got from killing monsters. It seemed like a good moment to call it quits and head back up to the surface. I had stayed down in the dungeon much longer than I initially planned. My eyes trailed back to the dead corpse of the infant dragon. Now, how the F was I going to remove this thing's monster crystal? Rias Gremory. Rias Gremory sat with her legs brought up to her chest as she stared outside her window. The crystal blue eyes she possessed that normally held cheer looked dead, the edges of her eyes were red and puffy. The younger daughter of the Gremory was an appealing young woman with long crimson hair, soft blue-greenish eyes, and fair soft skin. With an hourglass, she was a woman many sought the hand of. Currently, it had been a week since she had learnt of the disappearance of her precious younger brother, Zephyrion Gremory. To say she was shocked would be an understatement. Rias had spoken to her younger brother just a few hours prior to the incident. Mainly when she was trying to cuddle him and convince him to watch anime with her. Naturally, this had made her an emotional wreck as the underworld scrambled to search for him. Only to come up empty. This had made Rias even more distraught as no one decided it was worth the time to update her on what was happening. Akino Himejima stood behind her looking just as distraught as Rias. She and Zephyrion had been close ever since he would come in to calm her down when she awoke in a mess after experiencing nightmares of her mother dying. Akino was trying to keep strong but she had long since gained a bit of a dependence on Zephyrion's calming presence and his absence was bringing up her trauma once more. The thought of losing someone else she held dear and being powerless to stop it hurt her on a spiritual level. Rias simply continued to stare outside the window with her fists clenched. Rias knew Sona and the others were worried about her. After all, Sona had already attempted to contact her 3 times but Rias didn't have the energy. She had tried to go out and search with the rest of the underworld only to be rejected and placed on high security. The only thing she knew of was that Seraphol had felt a massive magical disturbance in Zephyrion's room which Ijukas and his peerage were combing through for any information. Seraphol herself had looked terrible. The short-stacked Satan no longer found herself acting in her normally cheerful demeanor but instead, she was cold and serious. To convey the seriousness of this matter, the shooting of her magical girls show has been cancelled for as long as Zeph isn't found. Rias hadn't seen her elder sister but she knew it couldn't be good. Serena had always had a certain obsession with Zephyrion and Rias could only imagine the state she was in. Rias didn't know what to do, she was stuck in the Gremory castle with an armada of guards surrounding her position. Normally she would binge-watch anime but even that didn't seem appealing. The magical circle of the Citri pulsed again as Sona attempted to call her, Rias simply stared at it apathetically. It continued to pulse for a few minutes before dissipating. She let out a depressed sigh. "Little brother, I wonder what you are doing now?" she mentally asked as she stared up into the purple sky. Zephyrion. Whistling, I exited the dungeon, covered in monster BLD with a giant monster crystal tucked in my right arm. My pouch was filled to the brim with monster crystals. I should look into maybe taking a bigger bag or finding someone to pick them up for me. So many monster crystals had been left behind. To be fair, I hadn't been planning on going so far down in the dungeon. I hadn't planned on spending so much time down there either. I had been forced to chuck all the goblin crystals away in favor of better monster crystals from lower floors. I started making my way towards the guild, unbothered by the large number of adventurers entering and exiting the dungeon. I didn't want to worry Hestia too much by being out longer than I had already been, so I made haste. Only to pause as I came across something, or rather someone. Sitting down slumped with dirt on his face was a familiar boy with pure white hair that also seemed to have dirt matted on it. The boy's expression was one of defeat and self-loathing. Holy SHT. Bell Cranel. So alright folks, that's all for today. Stay tuned for part 3. Do subscribe, like and share for more such videos. Also check out the story and author Totallynotsnipez on FANFICTIONnet. Press the bell icon to be notified first on release. See you in the next video. Till then, goodbye.